Well, let me put that aside and turn to another threat to survival, and not immediate, but imminent, and you're all aware of it. It's environmental catastrophe. The facts are familiar to anyone who bothers to read scientific journals, and each one is more alarming than the last one. So take a couple of very recent reports. On April 29th, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, government administration, gave its latest report on ocean surface temperatures off the northeast U.S. coast. They're the highest in 150 years. Drastic effects on ecosystems keep going up. A couple of weeks before that, Science magazine, the main scientific weekly, reported, I'll quote, a study that showed that even slighter, warmer temperatures, which are less than what's anticipated in the coming years, could start melting permafrost, mainly in Siberia, which in turn will trigger the release of huge amounts of greenhouse gases, methane, much worse than carbon dioxide, that are trapped in the ice. And that'll set off escalating, nonlinear processes of destruction. Geologists and archaeologists are now considering establishment of a new geological era. History is broken up into geological eras. The new eras they're discussing is what they're calling the Anthropocene, starting with the Industrial Revolution, which is having huge effects on the Earth. The preceding era, the Holocene, begins around 11,000 years ago, with simultaneous, about the time of the rise of agriculture. And the age before that, the Pleistocene, lasted 2.5 million years. You take a look at the acceleration, and that gives an indication of the fate towards which we're careening. Meanwhile, research papers in the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, super respectable report, I'll quote, 109 countries have enacted some form of policy regarding renewable power, and 118 countries have set targets for renewable energy. In contrast, one country, the United States, has not adopted any consistent and stable set of policies at the national level to foster the use of renewable energy. Now, that's not because of public opinion. Public opinion strongly supports measures to deal with a looming crisis. U.S. public opinion not very far from other parts of the world. And that's kind of interesting because, as I'm sure you know, there's been a massive corporate offensive here to convince them for years, to convince the public that either there's no global warming at all, or if there is, we don't have anything to do with it, no human contribution. Now, that offensive is now escalating, accelerating right now in interesting ways because of fears in the corporate sector that the public is just too infected by scientific rationality. And that's as big a threat as a deterrent. An interesting program being initiated by a group you may know of, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Sounds innocuous. It's a corporate-funded group that proposes legislation for state legislatures. You can imagine what they propose. And they got plenty of clout, given the wealth and power behind them, so a lot of these get accepted. There's a new one that's just being started. It's for K-12, kindergarten to 12th grade education programs. It's a program they're trying to convince state legislatures that they should introduce what they call balanced teaching to develop critical thinking. That sounds good. What's balanced teaching? That means, along with teaching what's called climate science, you should teach climate change denial to kindergartners and all the way up. Then they'll have critical thinking and we'll be better off. And there are a couple of states that have already adopted it, and we can expect a lot more like this. Well, put this aside and imagine what a future historian, assuming that there is one, and it's not obvious that there will be, but suppose there's a future historian who looks back at what's happening right before our eyes, looks back at the early 20th century, 21st century. Well, for the first time in history, humans are facing quite significant prospects of severe calamity, maybe destruction of the possibilities of decent survival as a result of actions of theirs. And it's not secret. Facts are before our eyes, despite the efforts of the corporate sector to conceal them. Most people see them. And there's a range of reactions around the world. At one extreme, there are some who are trying to act decisively to prevent possible catastrophe. At the other extreme, policies are designed to enhance the threat, while the most powerful domestic actors are undertaking major efforts to deny what's happening and to dumb down the population so they won't interfere with short-term profits. Leading the effort to intensify the likely disaster is the richest and most powerful country in world history, with incomparable advantages, along with Canada, which is in many ways even worse. We're leading the effort to preserve conditions in which our immediate descendants might have a decent life are the so-called primitive societies, the First Nations, tribal societies, indigenous societies, aboriginal societies. That's going on all over the world. In the Western Hemisphere, for example, the countries with large indigenous populations, Bolivia and Ecuador, are pursuing efforts to introduce what they call rights of nature. We've got to protect rights of nature. Ecuador is in, they have big indigenous populations, a majority in Bolivia. They are proposing, Ecuador is an oil producer, but they're seeking aid, financial aid, from the rich countries so that they can keep the oil underground where it's supposed to be, okay? That's the backward, primitive societies. And meanwhile, here we're racing with total enthusiasm towards quick disaster. Every time Obama or anyone else talks about 100 years of energy independence, as if it meant anything, what they're saying is, let's destroy the world as fast as we can. So suppose we get every drop of hydrocarbons out by fracking and tar sands and anything else you can think of. What's the world going to look like? Well, not our concern. That's the concern of primitive, backward people who have these sentimental ideas about rights of nature. Well, that's what a future historian will see if there is one. Well, let me just make a last comment about this. All of this, too, traces back to Magna Carta, 800 years ago. Magna Carta had two components. One is the Charter of Liberties, famous one, which I discussed, the foundation of Anglo-American law, now being torn to shreds before our eyes. The other part is what was called the Charter of Forests. That was dedicated to protection of the commons from the ravages of the power centers of the day. That record is preserved for us in things like the Robin Hood myths. That's what they're about. What are the commons? Well, the commons that weren't just the forests, they were the source of sustenance for the general population. Food, fuel, welfare. And there's a classic image of, it goes back to the Bible, of widows gleaning things from the commons for fuel and food. That's what the commons were. They were very carefully nurtured and protected for centuries by people like these primitive backward people today who are trying to save the planet. Now, in capitalist ethics, there's a different concept. It's called the tragedy of the commons. That's familiar. The thesis is that if the commons, if common possessions are left to the population, they'll be destroyed. So you have to privatize them and put them into the hands of the Koch brothers and so on. Then they'll be protected. That's capitalist ethics. Unless common possessions are privatized, they'll be destroyed. And there's a principle behind it. It's the principle that Adam Smith described as what he called the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. Everything for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. That's the concept that has to be drilled into people's heads to make them total sociopaths. Reality is, of course, quite the opposite. Privatization leads to destruction of the commons in pursuit of the vile maxim. Well, what happened to the Charter of the Forests? That was an equal part of Magna Carta. It was dismantled with the rise of capitalism in England centuries ago by enclosures and other measures to privatize the commons. It was followed centuries later in the United States. This central part of Magna Carta has long been forgotten, apart from the traditional societies that are trying to fend off the disaster that's approaching as we, in our brilliance, lead the way off the cliff like the proverbial lemmings.